Josh Gerstein now, senior reporter for Politico. So that we're clear, they're not denying that Jared Kushner requested that they set up this back channel so that they could communicate in some way without the United States knowing with the Russians, not through American equipment, but through the Russian secret communications devices. They're not denying that.
No, they're not, Shep. You're right about that. It's an unusual request. There are sometimes back channels, informal means of communications outside the normal lines of reporting. What's weird about this is that you have transition officials, so they're not officially in any U.S. government role, and to try to depend on the Russians to do this for you does seem, at a minimum, naive. It seems reminiscent of folks in past eras perhaps having like a transistor shortwave radio to try to keep in touch with people in another country.
Okay. If these things did happen, and the White House isn't denying them, what does that mean in the main? I mean, it's not, is that a crime?
No, I don't think just on its facts that it's a crime, but you can certainly see why the intelligence agencies and people who do this kind of counterintelligence work for a living would be immediately alarmed by this kind of behavior on the part of anybody whose activities they're looking into. If you had concerns that somebody might be up to something proper and you find out that they are trying to set up some kind of a secure communications channel, whether it be online or through an embassy or through radio or some other means, sure, that's a huge warning flag. Now, there may be a innocent or semi-innocent or naive explanation for this, but it's certainly something you'd want to talk to the person involved about what they were doing.
Now remember, for our viewers, remember how it is that they found out about this in the first place. Yeah, there was a leak. But how did they find out about it? Here's how they found out. They were monitoring the Russians. And while they're monitoring the Russians, as the story goes, all of a sudden there's Jared Kushner. And there they are discussing a back channel that doesn't involve United States equipment, but Russian equipment. And if that didn't happen, if Jared Kushner wasn't trying to hide things from the United States, then why would he do that? And if he didn't do that, please deny it so we can move on. Well, that opportunity was given today in the White House press briefing. Here, listen.
Does he approve of that action?
You're asking if he approves of an action that is not a confirmed action. That being said, I think Secretary Kelly and General McMaster have both discussed that in general terms, back channels are an appropriate part of diplomacy.
So does the White House dispute that happened?
I'm not going to get into it, but your question presupposes facts that have not been confirmed.
Well, they could have disputed it right there if it didn't happen. I mean, Jared Kushner's office is right there in the West Wing. He's the closest guy to the president, isn't he?
Well, he sure is, and they could have asked him, although at this point, anybody who's advised by legal counsel would probably want to get their lawyers involved in that discussion so it all doesn't just spill out in front of Congress or to FBI investigators. But those are the kinds of difficulties the White House has now in putting their story together, as you have outside lawyers and inside lawyers and communications people trying to come up with something that will sell to the public, and the lawyers, meanwhile, warning that you can't do certain things because that would go against their client's interest.
We've been dealing with the Russians as adversaries for a very long time, so it's hard to imagine a lot of new stuff could happen. But over the course of these transitions of presidencies, going way back to the Cold War and before, when was the last time a transition team tried to set up a back channel communication with the Russians that wouldn't involve the United States knowing about it?
I'm not aware of any situation like that. I mean, there's usually an exchange of courtesy calls with a lot of foreign leaders, and I think we heard about those kinds of calls, some of them controversial, some of them less so during the Trump transition. But the secure communications is very unusual. Now, maybe it was just to get a briefing from military folks on the ground, but the normal protocol, if you wanted to do that, would be to organize it with the outgoing administration to try to put in whatever communications they thought were necessary. Why it had to be protected from the outgoing administration is very hard to explain, and that's one of the first things I'd want to know if we were asking questions either the FBI or congressional investigators.
And so we're clear, he didn't tell anybody about it. When you go for security clearance, they ask you, what kind of communications have you, he didn't mention it, right?
There's no indication he mentioned it at the outset, and eventually he did report the meetings, but we're told that was on a second go-round.
Yeah, that was after someone heard him there. Josh Gerstein from